Welcome to the latest edition of Tune Diving. This is the Indo-Answers, and today we will be looking at one of my favorite compositions from the Santhosh Narayanan and Pradeep Kumar duo, the song Poo Avizhum from the film Yanakuluvan. In today's video, we will be exploring how Santhosh Narayanan breaks all sorts of musical conventions in order to draw a strong emotional response from us listeners. I believe the main idea Santhosh Narayanan establishes emotionally is a journey from instability to stability or from discomfort to comfort. We will be looking at how Santhosh Narayanan goes from unstable and uncomfortable to stable and comfortable through his treatment of mixing and specifically panning, as well as melody. Without further ado, let's jump right in. So first, we're going to be looking at mixing and specifically at panning, which essentially describes where sounds are placed. Is it placed on the left, on the right, somewhere in between, or with the latest technology even up and down? Panning in particular is what controls all of this. In order to understand the significance of Santhosh Narayanan's panning decisions in Poo Avizhum though, first let us take a moment to briefly understand the history of panning. Let's go back to around the 1930s and 40s. Music, of course, was very good, but sound and sound technology in particular left a little bit to be desired. Music could only be heard through mono channels, which meant that music could only be heard through one sound source. It was not possible to place sounds so that they were heard only on the left or only on the right or anything like that. That changed across the 1950s and primarily the 1960s. Now, stereo systems were developing, which meant that sounds could be heard through more than just the one channel. Now, with at least earlier stereo systems, sounds could be placed on the extreme left, the extreme right, or in the center. Nothing in between with the early stereo systems though, just those three spots. But this was the first time sound could be placed exclusively on either side. So musicians played around with this quite a bit, with one such example being the Beatles. Have a listen to this song, for example. Unfortunately, YouTube took down the audio I was going to use here due to copyright violations, so please instead refer to the video linked above or the video in the description. Please listen to the first 15 seconds of this song and then jump back to this video. Thank you. Notice, for example, here, that you can only hear the vocals on your right ear. You cannot hear the vocals at all in your left ear. This is because the vocal track has been placed on the extreme right channel, making it heard only on the right. When musicians place such important parts exclusively on the left or right channel, we call this extreme panning. Extreme panning was more common back then because musicians didn't really have a choice. If you didn't want your sound in the middle, you had to pick either extreme left or extreme right because of the limits on the technology back then. So musicians were often kind of forced to resort to extreme panning. Nowadays though, sounds can be placed on a spectrum. It doesn't have to be the extreme left or extreme right. With the latest technology, in fact, sound can be placed anywhere on a 360-degree spectrum. Because so many opportunities are available now, and musicians can pretty much place sounds wherever they want, placing sounds on the extreme left or extreme right, especially if they're important parts, is very uncommon. In other words, extreme panning is extremely uncommon, because unlike in the 1960s, musicians are not restricted to the extremes. But coming back to Poo Avizhum, Santhosh Narayanan essentially rolls back the years as he uses extreme panning. Listen to the opening of the song as we hear this painful sound seemingly coming from a guitar pedal. The fact that this sound comes solely on the right channel makes it feel very imbalanced and puts us listeners in a place of serious discomfort. In addition, the nature of the sound, the way it grows in volume, then suddenly drops in volume, adds to the tension and discomfort that this opening section of the song brings about. Of course, Santhosh Narayanan cannot continue making us feel uncomfortable throughout the whole song. If he did, it would be extremely disengaging for us listeners. Thus, while he does not give up extreme panning straight away, the panning does start to become a bit more balanced. In this next section, while the bass drum pattern is heard on both ears, it is only on the left ear where we hear the guitar line and we hear the same guitar pedals on the right ear that we heard in the section earlier. Now, even though extreme panning is still used, there's still a bit more balance now in the way the sounds are placed. As the song progresses, the panning of sounds in general start to become more conventional and much less extreme. The main parts are all panned much closer to the center, as would be the case in most music in general. But just because it becomes more conventional does not mean that it becomes bland or purposeless. Santhosh Narayanan utilizes a very wide mix here, where the sounds are really spread out across the sound spectrum. This gives the song a very open and spacey feel, giving the song the breathing space and giving the song life. More importantly though, this is an extremely balanced mix, where the main parts are panned much closer to the center and where only some of the subsidiary parts are panned wide. This is in stark contrast to the opening of the song, which felt so imbalanced and uncomfortable because the main parts were panned wide.
விடும் பொழுதில் ஓராயிரம் கனா வேகம் மேகம் மாகும் ஓர் நிலையே மேகம் கூடும் நேரம் பூமழையே
By making us deal with an almost sort of painful and certainly uncomfortable panning style in the beginning, Santhosh Narayanan makes us yearn for normality. When he does give us normality by slowly switching towards a more conventional mixing style, we enjoy that moment more than we usually would, because the extreme panning in the beginning made us feel so uncomfortable and made us yearn for comfort. We looked at how with panning, Santhosh Narayanan starts off with a foundation which is unconventional and slightly uncomfortable before shifting towards a more conventional style of mixing. He does something quite similar in terms of melody, to which we turn now. I'd like to dive into melody, where so many interesting things happen and where things get a little bit theoretical. Before I get into the nitty-gritty though, allow me to put forth some background information, which will ultimately help all of us understand the beauty behind Poo Avizhum's melody. Poo Avizhum is based on a scale called the E major scale. The E major scale consists of the following notes: E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp. Each of these notes plays a unique role within the context of this scale. E, the first note, or the sa in Indian classical terms, is essentially the home of the E major scale. It's the note that feels the most comfortable. This is the note that has no tension and hence feels most satisfying. If I play the E major chord and sing sa, sa, you can probably feel the comfort and the stability in what you just heard. Probably the second most comfortable note is the note B, or pa. Again, I can demonstrate in a similar fashion to what I did last time. So I'll play the E major chord and I'll sing ba. So you probably feel that stability and comfort yet again. So sa and pa, or E and B in the case of the E major scale, are the primary notes of comfort. But there's another note that feels very comfortable, and that's the note ga. So I'll do the same thing as I did before. I'll play the E major chord and sing ga. Ga. So again, you probably feel that stability and comfort, maybe not as much as sa and maybe not even as much as pa, but still it feels very stable and comfortable. So we've established sa, pa, and ga as the primary notes of comfort within a scale. And in the case of the E major scale, these are the notes E, B, and G sharp, sa, pa, and ga respectively. The E major chord is actually made up of these exact same notes. It's E, G sharp, and B. And so notice how the notes of comfort are the same as the notes of the chord. We call these notes chord tones because they are the tones or the notes in the chord. And it is often the chord tones that are the most stable within a scale. So that's that. But what about the other notes in the E major scale? F sharp, A, C sharp, D sharp, or D, ma, then E? Well, these are generally called passing tones, which are notes that you generally pass through in a melody but often don't end a phrase on. So all of these passing notes are comparatively unstable compared to the chord tones that we looked at earlier. And that's why phrases or melodies don't end on these passing notes as often. For example, if I ended a song like this, that probably doesn't feel as comfortable or stable an ending as this. Right? So the first example, I sang Re. Right? So Re is a passing tone, so it has a bit more tension and it's not quite as stable. And that's why it doesn't sound as conclusive as Sa. Right? So all of these passing tones, Re is an example of a passing tone, right? So the F sharp or Re, which is a passing tone, has a little bit of tension because it wants to resolve to its nearest chord tone, right? So one of the near chord tones to Re is Sa, right? So Re has a bit of tension because it wants to resolve to Sa, right? So Re, Sa, or F sharp, E, right? So you hear how the Sa or the E has much more stability and feels more comfortable compared to the passing tone of F sharp. F sharp could also resolve to G sharp because G sharp is also a chord tone that's near to F sharp, right? So Re, F sharp, Ga, G sharp, right? So D could resolve to either Sa or Ga or E and G sharp because they're both the nearest chord tones to F sharp. The same thing applies to all of the passing tones in a scale, right? So let's take Ma or A. Ma, Ga, right? So Ma is close to Ga, and so Ma wants to resolve to Ga because Ga is a chord tone and feels more stable. Ma, Ga. Same thing with Ma and Pa, right? Pa is also close to Ma, or B is also close to A, right? So Ma, Pa, right? A, B, right? So A wants to resolve to its nearest chord tones, which is either G sharp or B. Same applies to C sharp or Da, right? Da, Pa, right? So the closest chord tone to Da is Pa. The closest chord tone to C sharp is B, right? So C sharp wants to resolve to B. Da, C sharp, B, Pa, right? And there's no other close chord tone, so it's just the one chord tone that Da wants to resolve to. Same thing applies with Ni, right? Ni wants to resolve to the upper Sa, or D sharp wants to resolve to the upper E because it's the closest chord tone. Ni, Sa, D sharp, E, right? So all of these passing tones have a bit of tension because they want to resolve to its nearest chord tone, right? So chord tones are more stable and more comfortable compared to passing tones. Now, we've looked at chord tones and passing tones, but how about notes that are not in the scale at all? These are called accidentals, and these are notes that are not in the scale. They're not within the melodic framework of the song. So of course they sound very, very unstable and very uncomfortable. If I sing an example, for example, right? So right now I was singing the note A sharp with the chord E major. A sharp is not in the E major scale, right? So A sharp sounds really unstable and uncomfortable. Right? If you want another example, right? You probably think I'm singing wrong notes or something, right? And they're kind of wrong because they're not in the scale, right? And that's why they sound so unstable and so uncomfortable. So with that, we've covered the 3 types of notes: chord tones, passing tones, and accidentals. And we've looked at how they get increasingly unstable. With that in mind, now we can better understand the beauty behind the melody of Poo Avizhum. The melody starts quite normally. It starts on a chord tone, G sharp, goes through 2 passing notes, and then lands on another chord tone, B, right? So 2 passing tones are A and C sharp, and then lands on a chord tone, B. So the melody goes, and then the melody descends down to the other chord tone, which is E. So already we hear the kind of typical structure of the melody, or at least the typical treatment of notes within a melody. The notes that he spends the most time on are generally the chord tones, and the notes that he passes through in order to get from one chord tone to another are the passing tones, right? So this melody right here, so the notes that he sits on are G sharp, B, and E, the chord tones, right? So nothing really unexpected here. Now let's look at the next line, which is much less conventional than the previous line. So Santhosh Narayanan still starts off with a chord tone, G sharp, but then he uses an accidental G, right? So the line goes, oh, ra. So that note in the middle is an accidental. Oh, that's an accidental. And then the next note is G sharp, back to a chord tone, but then he uses 2 accidentals consecutively. So that's A sharp and C. A sharp and C are both accidentals, right? So now Santhosh Narayanan is really making strange melodic decisions. Accidental, accidental, accidental. So, like, what's going on here? What Santhosh Narayanan has done here actually is he has briefly changed keys. So initially we were in E major, right? Now let's look at the notes he uses in the Orairam Kana phrase. We see the notes G sharp, A sharp, C, C sharp, D sharp, and also G. And this actually lines up with the notes of the G sharp major scale, which has the notes G sharp, A sharp, C, C sharp, D sharp, F, and G. So what Santhosh Narayanan has actually done here is, for just these few seconds, he has changed the scale from E major to G sharp major. And this is a really creative way of adding instability to a melody. And the way he does it actually makes a lot of sense too. Let's look at how Santhosh Narayanan enters the key of G sharp major. He uses the note G sharp as a pivot. G sharp is a chord tone in both E major, because the chord tones of E major are E, G sharp, and B. And it's a chord tone in G sharp major as well, as the chord tones in G sharp major are G sharp, C, and D sharp, right? So G sharp is a useful pivot because it's a common chord tone between E major and G sharp major. And the G in between the 2 G sharps. So when we have that G sharp in the middle, if we're thinking in terms of E major, then it sounds just like a short accidental, and since it is short, it sounds like something Santhosh Narayanan might throw in just to add some flavor in between the 2 G sharps, right? But now we know that this sort of portion, these 2 measures, are actually in G sharp major. And if you remember the notes of G sharp major, G is actually the 7th note of the G sharp major scale. And so by using this G, he prepares our ears for G sharp major, for the sound of G sharp major. And so this G actually helps prepare our ears transition from E major to G sharp major. And this allows the A sharp and C that comes afterwards in the phrase to make sense, even though they're not in the original E major scale. So because he uses this G sharp, our ears accept, at least to a certain extent, this A sharp and C. If Santhosh Narayanan didn't use that G, maybe the A sharp and C that come afterwards would both seem a little too sudden and out of place. but because of the way he uses the notes G sharp and G, it allows for a relatively smooth transition, while of course still maintaining the surprise and sort of unstable element that such a drastic key change inevitably brings about. But this shift in key to G sharp major is supposed to be brief. This is just supposed to be a brief moment of discomfort. He needs to find a way to transition back into the original key of E major. He does that by using the final two notes of the Orairam Kanal line. The notes are C sharp and D sharp, notes that are in both the G sharp major scale and the E major scale. And if we look at the next note in the song after the C sharp and D sharp, it's an E, right? And so this line, C sharp, D sharp, E, it's a line that ascends naturally and lands on the comfort spot of the E major scale, which is the note E. Right? So by landing on the comfort spot of E major, it allows our ears to fully transition back into E major. And plus, in the key of E major, D sharp is a passing tone which naturally wants to lead to its nearest chord tone, which is E. So this makes the transition all the more smooth. So by using common notes between the E major scale and G sharp major scale, namely C sharp and D sharp, Santhosh Narayanan smoothens the transition back into E major from G sharp major. Now, we've had our moment of discomfort, and now we need to move towards a place of comfort. And so as the song progresses, at least in the Pallavi, we hear no more accidentals or key changes or anything like that, and the song shifts towards the more stable chord tones. For example, if we look at the Degam, Megum, Agum, Ornileye line, it goes, so there it lands on the E, right? Degam lands on the E, lands on the G sharp, lands on the B, so the three notes it's landed on are the three chord tones, and then it finishes off on the E, right? So the notes it spends the longest time on are the chord tones. Right? So now we can see how Santhosh Narayanan is taking us back to a place of comfort by emphasizing the chord tones and by reducing the usage of even passing tones and particularly of accidentals. So even if we look at the final sort of subsection of the Pallavi from Yenmo Chikuralile, from that part, it follows a similar trend of emphasizing the chord tones, right? So that line goes, right? So it spends the most time on B and E, and it finishes on the B, right? So again, it's kind of emphasizing the chord tones by emphasizing the B and the E, and by not using accidentals or change of key or anything like that. So it's bringing us that comfort by emphasizing the chord tones. So in today's analysis, we looked at Poo Avizhum and how Santhosh Narayanan creates a journey from discomfort to comfort through panning as well as melody. With panning, he started off the song with the unusual and extremely uncomfortable extreme panning before moving towards a more conventional form of panning. With melody, he created discomfort with this brief key change into G sharp major, but then resolved that tension by shifting more towards the chord tones in the key of the original E major. Of course, I'm aware that we've only really kind of analyzed the Pallavi of the song, but for this video, just to save time, I've kind of stuck with just the main points, and that's why I stuck with the Pallavi. Alright, so that does it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any thoughts or suggestions with regards to this video, or with regards to future videos you want me to make. Please do check out our social media and follow us on all of the relevant platforms through the links in the description. Thank you so much once again, and we'll see you next time.